Thank you so much for joining us today on our webinar on Muslims and mediation, marking Conflict Resolution Day. Thank you everybody for joining. It's actually a very auspicious day. It's 30 years since the formal repeal of apartheid laws on the 15th of October 1990. And this event is brought to you by two non-profit NGOs, UK-based New Horizons in British Islam. You can look up our website at nhorizons.org. This is a forward-looking organization that engages in critical discussions around Muslim identity, tradition, and reform to provide a positive vision of what it means to be Muslim today. And we have US-based Karamah at karamah.org, which is committed to promoting human rights globally, especially gender equality, religious freedom, and civil rights in the US. So please do look up their websites, follow on social media, join mailing lists, tweet, like, share, etc. You know the score. I'm your host today. My name is Dilwar Hussain. I'm assistant professor at the Center for Trust, Peace and Social Relations at Coventry University in the UK. And I'm chair of the organization New Horizons in British Islam. Now, we have an amazing lineup for our panel. So let me just go through their names. You are already familiar with them because you've registered for the event. But we have Mr. Jean Ayoub, who's Secretary General and CEO of the International Social Services in Geneva. We have Kim Lecoyer, who's a lecturer and researcher working on issues of gender and diversity in family support and conflict mediation, and she's president of Karamah EU. We have Ayoub, who's an attorney and social entrepreneur, working to advance ADR opportunities in Muslim American community. We have Dr. Abdalla, who's Professor Emeritus at the United Nations mandated University for Peace, UPEACE, and he's also a senior advisor on conflict resolution and a senior fellow at Karamah. And last but by no means least, we have Dr. Mohamed M Keshavjee, very much the force behind this, the energy behind this event really, and he's an international specialist on cross-cultural mediation and an author of the book Islam, Sharia and Alternative Dispute Resolution. So without further ado, let me ask Jean Ayoub, Secretary General and CEO of the International Social Services in Geneva, to start his keynote.
Thank you, Dilwar. Thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you this afternoon. It's really heartwarming to see so many attendees about to discuss a topic that is very close to my heart: mediation, conflict resolution. And I believe a topic and an expertise that is essential today in our crazy world. You know, we know our world has gone crazy lately, not only this year, but many years back and from now. And I think the skills you all represent around the screen and all our attendees are very, very much in need in these days. I just want to talk a little bit about my organization. Since 96 years, ISS was designing individual solutions to complex social problems. This is what we do. And for 96 years, and we did not call it that yet, back then that, and we use what we call a mediation-based approach to have the results we need to have when we are reuniting families, when we are protecting children, and things like that. But clearly, we have not invented that approach. As you know, all you are the experts. Conflict resolution in mediation started in ancient Greeks, where the elderly had already were doing that, and they were called in those days mediums. We do 70,000 cases every year, and we use in practically every single case of them the mediation-based approach to get our results. Today, for my speech, I will not talk about mediation, because obviously this is something that you will cover, mediation and conflict resolutions. There are so many experts around the table. I would like to talk about women and men that I am fascinated with. I'm the mediators. You know, I have known Mohamed for many years now, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank him for inviting me to be the guest speaker, but to take the opportunity to thank him in public for all the work he has done for us here in ISS to produce our guide for international family mediation that we have published 3 or 4 years ago. And again, I said, I will not talk about the topic. I will talk about the men and women. So I look at Muhammad, I will look at Chilja Karash, a friend as Muhammad, and an eminent mediator like you who helped me a lot to understand that topic, and who was the director of our programs at ISS, the International Family Mediation Program. So I look at you and I look at Muhammad, I look at my notes, and I remember all the good people, the mediators, the conflict resolutors that I have met. And I dressed the profile, if you allow me. I'm not reinventing the wheel. I'm just stating the evidence. And I think we need to state the evidence from time to time to remember who we are. I mean, for me, the mediator is an articulate person. He or she inspires credibility. The mediator set forth accuracy, coherence, and consistency. This is important. The mediator has to be alert at all times, with his or her senses out at any moment for any sign or emotion or opportunity that might affect the mediation, the conflict resolution process. The mediator exercises utmost tact, patient, joining pieces together slowly but surely for progress to be made. The mediator is versatile, multi-skilled, resilient, and possesses a high degree of adaptability, in an ever-changing and emotionally charged situations. The mediator exercises self-restraint. For me, the mediator is the representation, what I would call, what many call, a person who is calm, cool, and collected. The mediator is objective, realistic, with both feet on the ground. The mediator knows the law, knows what is possible, and knows what is not possible under those laws, and make that understandable. Last but not least, mediators press in a subtle, gentle, but firm manner. They take initiative when silence replaces emotions around the table of mediation of conflict resolution, or through a screen in nowadays. These mediators are special to me, but to those in desperate need of your skills, essentially and usually children caught around the table, caught into the crossfire of family dispute. Let me share with you just two testimonies from both ends of the equation that we have published in our book. One quote from a mediator. In a small number of cases, one parent was nervous about meeting the other parent, but once the mediation commenced, the parent felt safe and therefore was able to speak freely and unhindered regarding the best interest of the child, of their child. I'll give you a testimony from a child. I felt like I was caught between two fires, with the decision of staying in Africa or returning to Canada. I was able to speak freely to the mediator, alone, and to release that tension. That in turn helped me to talk openly to both of my parents and find a solution. Abraham Lincoln was heard once saying, "A good settlement is better than a lawsuit." Kim, Aisha, Dilwar, Amr, Muhammad, Suraya, and Manish, thank you very much for this opportunity. I really wish you very, very, very constructive and positive discussions. Salam, peace be on you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean. And I know that Jean's taken out some very precious time from a very busy schedule right now. In fact, he will probably have to leave quite soon because he's due in another meeting, very important strategic meeting. So thank you very much for those very really important sort of framing words and important words about the role of mediators and the ethos with which mediators work. Let me go to the panel because we'll be throughout this the sort of the rest of the hour or so. We'll be engaging with our panelists, hearing from them, asking questions to them. Let me go to Dr. Keshavjee first. We'll go to Mohammed, then Kim, then Aisha, and then Dr. Abdalla. And I guess initially in the first round, it's a general question because we're talking about mediation and you all work in very different contexts, in very different parts of the world and some across the world. So Dr. Keshavjee, tell us, what is mediation? What is it a response to? And tell us a little bit more about your specific work in this area.
Thank you, Dilbar. Thank you, Jean, for those very kind words. I'll give a basic definition that we could work around with, and I'm sure my colleagues would add to it to make it more nuanced. Basically, mediation is a process by which two or more parties to a dispute agree to resolve their dispute, otherwise than going to a court of law and having a judge make a decision for them. It's an out-of-court type of settlement process. Now, it has certain attributes. It's a voluntary process. You can't coerce people into going for mediation. People have to agree to mediate. If one party doesn't agree, there can be no mediation. It's a flexible process. It's informal. It is confidential. So a court of law cannot come in and say, tell us what you were discussing during mediation and use it against one or the other parties. So it's non-binding. It's non-binding until the parties agree to agree, after which it becomes like a binding contract. The mediator has to be neutral. He has to be impartial. And mediation as a process is much quicker. So those are the general basic definitions and attributes of mediation. Now you may ask us, what is that a response to? Because I remember when I was young, my father was in business. He'd have disputes with his brothers or his friends or whoever, and he'd say, I'm going to go to my lawyer. Nobody ever said 30, 40 years ago, hey, I'm going to go to my mediator, because our culture was more litigation oriented. Now you may ask, what is this whole process a response to? Well, for decades now, the civil justice system globally is under tremendous challenge. The civil justice system in every country cannot process the number of cases that are coming through the system. It is universal. Number two, firstly, it's overburdened. Secondly, the civil justice system, by its very nature, is long-winded. There are delays, because lawyers delay. It depends on which side you are. So through all sorts of motions in a court of law, you mess around and the case never comes to the court. And the client keeps on paying until you come to the court. Incidentally, in that context, there's research that's been done that 93% of the cases that are ever filed in a court of law never really get heard. They get settled just before the day of the hearing. And everybody pays money for getting right up to the crib of the court when they could have done a settlement earlier. So it's costly, it's overburdened, there are delays, and principally, litigation destroys relationship. I can quote Judge Scott Bernstein of Florida, the court in Florida. He used a beautiful phrase many years ago. He says the adversarial system has destroyed the human family. And from my anecdotal experience, go to any family that's had a divorce problem. When you get into a court of law, it's the end. You may win the battle, you will lose the territory. So it's a response to all these principles. And this challenge is not new. If you read Charles Dickens' Bleak House, this has been for the last 200 years. And so what is alternative dispute resolution, ADR? Cynical lawyers in the early days, when you told them, I'm in ADR, they'd say, well, ADR, that means alarming drop of revenue, because they knew if there's an alternative form of justice, does it mean the lawyers will lose money? But as time has shown, it is not that straightforward, because nobody loses. I mean, lawyers themselves have co-opted this process. And a defining moment for alternative dispute resolution was in 1976. It was in 1976 when Warren Burger, the Chief Justice of America, called upon a very leading professor from Harvard University called Frank Sender and says, Professor Sender, what can you do for us to see if there is another way of doing business rather than going to litigation? And Professor Frank Sender was the man who actually coined this phrase and has made a massive, massive contribution to the whole notion of alternative justice, not only in the United States, but globally. So just as an envelope for us to start discussing. Now, quickly, I don't want to take too long. How did I get involved in this whole field? Well, I did my master's at SOAS about 20 years ago. And just as I was finishing, at the end of my degree, my master's degree, I was working for the Aga Khan. He signed as the Aga Khan at his secretariat. And the Aga Khan saw this as a great opportunity to use the structures of the Ismaili community worldwide and to see how can we refurbish them, if you may, but not to lose the baby with the bathwater. He was very clear in his vision that there's a lot we have in indigenous systems, but what can we do to refurbish them, to learn the modern principles of mediation and its relationship to the legal systems of the various countries that we're working in. And so I was tasked with that, with a team of people to work with two major British organizations called the Center of Dispute Resolution, Effective Dispute Resolution, and the National Family Mediation. And we started with 16 people 20 years ago. I'm very happy to say today that we have a transnational ADR system globally with over 1,000 mediators trained in over 25 countries. And this is not only in the Ismaili community, we've trained mediators in other communities to help them to deal with this conflict resolution. So I've come to this thing as a student. I'm not a specialist. I know we referred to as an international specialist, but every day is a learning process. And I think these type of seminars also bring together the dialogic dimension we need today. So I will rest my case there because I'm sure my colleagues have a lot more to offer and to add to this.
Thank you so much. It's so rich and we're just getting started. Thank you very much, there, Mohammed. So let's move to Kim and I'll address the same general question to you. Tell us what you think or what you know mediation is and also tell us more about your work in this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dilwar. As to the definition of mediation, I think what Mohammed proposed as a general working definition is going to be very useful to all of us. So for now, I'm not going to add much to that. Maybe I can tell the story of how I came to have a link with this subject. I currently am a researcher and lecturer at the Center for Family Studies at Odyssey University College in Brussels, Belgium. And the topic I work on there is basically offering family support to culturally and religiously diverse families. And then mainly comes to developing a reflection of how to overcome the important thresholds that relate to culture and religion when it comes to supporting families. And I also, and there the link with mediation is more clear, even more clear. I'm a PhD student at the Human Rights Center of Ghent University, also in Belgium. And doctoral research that I have been conducting over the past years and that I'm about to finalize right now concerns family conflicts within Belgian Muslim families. And I have been more specifically paying attention to the rights of women in situations of family conflicts within Belgian communities. So I've been looking at different types of conflicts. Marital difficulties and divorce have been a very important part of the conflicts that I've studied, but also conflicts related to partner choice and other intergenerational conflicts. We've been looking at both what state-based resolution can mean for Muslim families, going to a judge, going to a court, and what alternatives can bring in terms of solutions. And interestingly, we found that there is very little to no recourse to officially accredited family mediators within Belgian Muslim communities. And we found that that is related to the fact that there are different types of norms involved in the very conflict themselves. It's not just about the law, it's also about cultural norms and religious norms. And therefore, when seeking for ways to resolve the conflicts, people are looking for ways that will take into account these different layers of norms. And specifically in the Belgian context, because basically I will be talking mainly based on this experience in Belgium. Basically, the secular legal system will disregard any purely religious norms when it comes, for instance, to a divorce that is brought before a state court. And so spontaneously, what we've seen is that Muslim families tend to turn foremost to community leaders, to imams, to mosque workers, with questions that concern their ethical obligations as Muslims. And there is kind of a wall of separation between answers they will get from legal professionals that will look at their problems from a purely legal viewpoint, and religious actors that will look at these problems from a very religious viewpoint. But in real life, you need to be able to combine these, bring it together, and find a solution that takes these different dimensions into account. And so I'll probably have a chance to give a few examples as we go on with this debate. A last thing that I would like to mention is that besides my role as a researcher, I have also been involved in the topic of mediation as I am the chair of Karamah Europe. So that's the European sister organization to the US-based Karamah Muslim Women Lawyers for Human Rights. And based on this observation in my PhD research, that particularly for women, finding solutions that allow to harmonize legal approaches to family conflict with gender equitable interpretations of Islamic principles was really crucial. And so we felt at Karamah in Europe that there was a need to train interveners on 3 levels at the same time. So what we offered in 2015, and we hope inshallah in the future to be able to do that again, we developed a training course for community actors and other social workers that wanted to develop a gender sensitivity that can be deployed in Islamic contexts, together with, secondly, conflict resolution skills, and then thirdly, reflection about interaction between national and regional, European or other secular legal systems and Islamic norms at the very practical level, in terms of how to conclude a marriage, how to get out of a marriage, how to deal with inheritance, and so on and so forth. But I'll stop here.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That's so rich. And you know, we're getting so much granular detail here. And it's interesting how your different areas of work are complementary, but also so different. Aisha, please take us to the next stage. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to join this timely discussion. It is an absolute honor to be here with international leadership and ADR practitioners. I am an attorney based in North Texas and a social entrepreneur working to further expand the presence of a national and regional mediation infrastructure to serve the Muslim American diaspora. My interest in ADR sparked many years ago when I took part in the William Viz International Commercial Arbitration Moot in Vienna. And it was as a law student that I gained this perspective on the different pathways to conflict resolution, with obviously mediation being one of those pathways. And in furtherance of my work and my legal background, I am in the process of obtaining a mediation license with the state of Texas, which is actually not a requirement here, but a recommended practice. And alongside this training, I am actively working with experienced mediators to better understand the real world practice of mediation. And this has involved working with organizations like the Texas Muslim Women's Foundation on an educational event last year where I discussed peacemaking in the home and the workspace. And I would just say, as ADR training is the first step for an aspiring mediator, similarly, community education and awareness is equally significant. And it really should be one of the first steps prior to introducing a mediation model to our communities. This year, I worked with a subcommittee of the Dallas-Fort Worth Muslim Bar Association to conduct a survey of masajids and Islamic organizations in North Texas to flag priority issues that they face on a regular basis. And the results of the survey indicated a strong need for mediation services to address a variety of conflicts, from employment disputes to family disputes, as well as interorganizational and intra-organizational issues. The community survey reinforced the fact that we really have our work cut out for us. But I would say overall, we are truly blessed as a Muslim American community with leaders who have been organizing in this area for several decades now. And it is my hope that conversations like this can help move us in the right direction as we further develop mediation opportunities by sharing best practices and supporting those vulnerable communities who suffer the most when faced with inevitable conflict.
Oh, thank you so much. I love it when panelists finish before their time. That's really great. It gives more time for the audience. Thank you very much indeed. So next to Dr. Amr Abdullah, please.
Thank you so much, Dilwar, and to all the panelists and all the audience. I think I am actually in a good position to be the last one to speak about my reflections on mediation, because I can benefit from all the rich information that my colleagues already shared, and I will build on them. I was impressed already by the definitions, the concise definitions that Mohammed introduced, by the practical dimensions that Kim provided, and the dilemmas and the ethical issues that we are dealing with. And then, of course, by all the effort that Aisha explained about, and the promise of what mediation can do in the Muslim world. I will share also from my own stories, and perhaps I will lay it out with stations in my life that led me to believe that mediation in general, and especially in the Muslim context, is a necessity. My early career in Egypt, where I grew up and started my career, was a public prosecutor in the late 70s, early 80s. And as a prosecutor, even though I dealt mainly with criminal cases, but there were every now and then family disputes or other type of community disputes that included a criminal element. And that's why, as a prosecutor, I had to deal with them. I was always saddened by the family conflict that came my way that included some criminal element, because I needed to deal with them as a prosecutor. Nothing major criminally. For example, like two husband and wife are fighting and they're getting divorced, and one of them claimed that the other stole their property or whatever, or some belongings. And that makes it a criminal issue, even though it is just an allegation. But all in all, I found that actually every time I stepped out of my position as a prosecutor and put on a mediator hat in my room as a prosecutor and tried to work between the spouses or family members, I actually achieved better results. Better results for the litigants or the two people who are fighting. And they walked away actually reconciled and feeling good about it. But I was always criticized by my supervisors, because they said it's not your job to mediate with those people. Your job is to be a prosecutor. I still remember very well a colleague of mine. He was from a rural background. And one time he got a case where two families started to fight and even used guns to shoot at each other. Nobody was killed or hurt, but there was, of course, the criminal aspect of using unlicensed guns. Using his ruler understanding of how to deal with such conflicts, he started to do some form of mediation as a traditional leader. And he actually resolved the conflict very well, and everyone walked away happy, except his boss, of course, who had to reprimand him for not taking care of the legal element or the criminal element in the case. With such experiences, I moved on to the United States to study in the field of peace and conflict. And that's when I came across that. Maybe the second station is learning about mediation from an academic perspective. And I will dare to say with high influence of Western perspective on what mediation is. And to see over the last 30 years how this notion of mediation has developed to be embracing of different culture meanings and contexts, like my colleagues mentioned. And I was struck, I will say, but by realizing that the notion of the professionalization of mediation and the insistence in some settings in the North to make it a profession, which is fine, and I think it is needed. But I found that actually, and that's the approach I have been taking in my work, is to develop this education and training, I think like Kim said, to make mediation more popularized, to give this skill and knowledge to more people on the ground. And that maybe came directly from my PhD dissertation, where I looked at conflicts in the Egyptian society. And I found that people in the communities, families, workplace, and so on, they actually have the ability to mediate, and often they prefer this over going to any formal venue. However, they didn't have the right skills. It's not like everyone who wants to play mediator is doing a good job. As a matter of fact, they often did a bad job because they didn't know what they were doing. They only had the good intention. And that made me realize that actually the training on and education on mediation must happen on all levels, because people are doing it anyway, and especially in our Muslim communities. And that actually led me to develop programs of training and education related to mediation, especially as it applies in the Islamic context. Because I think, as my colleagues mentioned, that there is a uniqueness when it comes to the Muslim context, where we have to struggle between different value systems, at least that's how I call them, between the religious, the traditional, and the modern. And how can we enmesh all of them together in order for us to be able to do something effective that is going to be useful for such communities. I have been doing this practice of training and education in mediation in many parts of the world. Sometimes when needed, I do it just in a universal sense, and then when needed with the Islamic perspective. And I found that actually, once you start to use the Islamic perspective on mediation, you realize that actually we need to move a little bit farther from the classic traditional way that we have been studying our faith and religion, which we call fiqh. Because to the extent that we insist on the fiqh, we find that there is a highly legalistic approach to how we look at things. And that is not working well with when we think of mediation with the human element that comes with it. That doesn't mean that we have to surrender to the legal fiqh and make it our foundation. No, we need to explore new ways of how we can read and understand our resources in Islam in order to make it effective. This has been my practice that I have been working with. I found that this approach has been useful. It highlights to people things that they have not been aware of. And when they start to embrace it and see how to apply it in their own life as a method of resolving conflict, they realize that in doing this, you're actually adhering better to your Islamic roots and the values. At the same time, you are free to do it in a way that will be appropriate. I think I have to stop here, and I will continue as I answer more questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to push everyone, but I think it's useful just to get that interaction going. But let's stay with Dr. Abdalla, because you worked in very in very different contexts. You're now in the US. You've been in Egypt. You worked on cross-cultural mediation in various countries. And I guess carrying on from what you were saying, is there one global model that all cultures and communities can use, or are there different models? And why is this important in Muslim contexts?
Excellent. I think definitely there is not one global model. And it is great to see how scholars in the field of peace and conflict resolution, and particularly mediation, have recognized this. I give one example of the famous scholar Christopher Moore, who wrote one of the important books in the field, The Process of Mediation. I remember when I first read his first edition of his book on mediation, he presented his 12-step approach and the model of mediation pretty much as a universal approach. And that's it. This is mediation. And it maybe at that point, he was not aware of the underlying value values that shaped what mediation is. But it was interesting that in the second edition of his book, he acknowledged immediately in the introduction, after maybe 10, 15 years of working in the field, in the world, and realized that, well, there are other forms of mediation than what he thought was mediation. And he made that very clear in his introduction. And he put one of the charts in his book that I use all the time, where he differentiated between 5 types of mediators. And maybe the 2 extremes were what he called the independent or professional mediator. And this is the one that you get the training and you get the court approval to be a mediator. And you get the training that is reflecting 100%, again, the Western, but has to quote unquote values. On the other extreme was the social network mediator. And this is somebody who is grounded in the community, knows the people, and selected to be a mediator because actually of the previous relationship that they have with the parties and the trust that they have in the credibility and honesty of the person. Not because they are distant, they have no previous relationship, total opposites. But it was brilliant of Chris Moore to acknowledge that both are forms of mediation. And I think we in the Muslim context should have the ability to move back and forth between those 2 models. We don't need to put ourselves in one box because our community is so diverse all over the world, even within the one country. And if we try to apply only one model and say this is the Islamic, then no, we have a problem here. I think we have to be able to adjust based on the situation and benefit of this human knowledge about mediation in order for us to develop what is appropriate. And in the process, learn what are the critical elements from our Islamic perspective that must be included no matter which direction we are moving. That is one. I also want to say that from my experience teaching and training on mediation and other forms of methods of conflict resolution, I find that actually mediation is quite a serious tool that you use in order to try to intervene. It's almost like a doctor, a surgeon, who knows how to use a knife to cut a person in order to perform a surgery. Now, if I only train surgeons to know how to use a knife to cut a body without giving them the background in physiology and biology, then we are up to serious, serious trouble. And I believe that equally, in order for us to train qualified mediators who know what they are doing and to know how to use the tool properly, they must get the underlying knowledge about peace and conflict resolution and to understand some of the conceptual frameworks that will help them to know why are they using mediation in this way in a certain situation and why they use it in a different way in another situation, especially in our Islamic context. This will be important given that we need to be able to navigate and move back and forth.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And I'm sorry for rushing you there. Thank you. I know there's so much to unpack from these points. These are really important gems that are being covered here. And your point here about the diversity of Muslim thought and the plurality of Muslim approaches. So there isn't a single Muslim form of mediation. And I know there are 1 or 2 questions coming up about that. It's really good, even at this stage, to acknowledge that inherent plurality and diversity within Islamic thoughts. Let's go to Kim, because you're working in Belgium, you're working within a European context. Amr is in America, and he has experience in other parts of the world. So are Muslims in the diaspora embracing mediation as a concept in your experience? And if so, what are the challenges in doing so? How does this work? How does this work out in real life situations, bearing in mind principles of human rights, gender equality, fairness, inheritance rules, and so on and so forth?
Thank you very much, Dilwar, for this interesting question. As I said earlier already, mediation as a concept, as a profession, actually, is not yet being very much embraced from what I could see in Belgian Muslim communities. However, the term Islamic mediation is being used a lot, but what it refers to is not necessarily the profession as mediation professionals and practitioners know it and use it, and as Mohamed has very well defined it here in the beginning. when the Muslims I talk to in my interviews refer to the notion of Islamic mediation, they were actually referring more to something that comes close to conciliation. And I would say even Islamic counseling. They were looking for Islamic advice on interpretations of religious norms that apply to a particular conflict situation. And maybe I can give an example. One of the stories that touched me the most was the story of a woman whose marriage broke down because her husband decided at one point to take a second wife. And in the beginning of their relationship, they agreed that their marriage would be a monogamous one. They were completely on the same line on this, and they even had an explicit stipulation in their Islamic marriage contract saying that this was going to be a monogamous marriage. Years passed by, and then at one point, this happened. And as you can imagine, there is a very universal theme there. What happens when someone you dearly love breaks such an important vow? That's not necessarily something Islamic. It's very human. It's very relational. But at the same time, there was something very important going on that related to entitlement based on Islamic norms. What is his right in this situation? What is her right? And of course, this happened in Belgium. There is absolutely no legal space for polygamy in the Belgian context. And so she was actually a law student at the time we interviewed her. And she was very much aware that actually she could even have her husband prosecuted. So all these different elements were going on in this single situation, and she ended up exactly as I said in my introduction. She ended up turning to many different Islamic counselors. She ended up talking to a lawyer, but no one was actually able to give her a solution or to help her find a solution, mediated solution with her husband that also concerned their property, their children, and so on, that would take into account these different dimensions all at once. However, theoretically speaking, mediation has this potential because in contrast to a judge that can only apply the legal rules from the country, a mediator should actually work with whatever is important to the parties involved in the mediation process. That's what some experts will call the internormative potential of mediation. You can find a common ground based on whatever matters to the parties. There is, however, at the same time, a downside to mediation, and especially, we've seen it in this case, but there are many others, especially when it comes to important power imbalances. And as a matter of fact, we've seen that interpretations that favor men happen to be socially more dominant, and it is harder for women to question or challenge interpretation that disfavor women. And that has a lot more to do with patriarchy than it has with Islamic norms as such, of course. But that's a topic that mediators need to be able to engage with. And mediation models, as we now have them, do, in my view, not sufficiently engage on the theoretical level with how to deal with normative questions on the one hand and how to deal with power imbalances on the one hand. And so I think these are probably the most important challenges that need to be resolved for mediation to become, to realize the potential that it actually has for use within Muslim communities, but also broadly speaking.
Let me go to Aisha. So on this point about perhaps women being disadvantaged, So do people raise, in your experience, do people raise those sorts of concerns, and how are you seeing that play out in the US?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question, and thanks to Kim for so eloquently stating a lot of this stuff about the power imbalances. So in the context of family disputes, I did want to take a step back and share a research-based observation, which was presented by the Institute for Family Studies. And that is that men tend to benefit the most from the institution of marriage in general. So with that as a premise, you could say women are at a disadvantage from the start. And to add to this, when cultural baggage in a domestic setting becomes more dominant than that which is required by Islamic Sharia, even in the Muslim communities in the West, I mean, I do see this here as well, women are routinely held responsible for the abuse that they face. And it's really alarming, you know, when you come across these situations. So going back to your question, I would say mediation actually gives women an opportunity to confront and attempt to de-escalate a conflict with a fact-based analysis in the presence of a neutral. And I do want to stress this point a bit. I don't think we've covered this yet, but a neutral is someone that does not have a conflict of interest, essentially. And so in a family dispute, let's say, you know, you take an issue that you may be facing with your spouse, say to your in-laws, and you're seeking a fair outcome. Will that really be to your advantage? It won't. And so these situations create prejudices against the woman in the situation, which kind of goes back to why seeking timely and professional mediation is absolutely critical, and why having this professional model would empower the parties. One concern that I have heard from women who have gone through mediation, even within Muslim environments, is again this cultural burden they face. So in legal terms, I wanted to kind of expand on the term, like, what's a burden? So a burden refers to a greater obligation on one party to prove a fact. And unfortunately, oftentimes the burden ends up falling on the person seeking the mediation, which again, in most family-based cases, ends up being the woman. So as an example of this cultural burden in family contexts, in family conflicts, women may be asked to inadvertently prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they have been obedient to their spouse. So this is just one example. It's like, okay, what have you done? You know, like, how did you contribute to this? So it's that line of questioning, kind of going back to Kim's point earlier about the way that the existing model may be handled by, patriarchal norms. So the thing is they don't do, like, it's basically questioning the women. Like they didn't do anything to provoke the spouse to act irrationally. And this cultural presumption of innocence in these cases is routinely, I would say, awarded to men, which is then detrimental to conflict resolution, because women have to go to greater lengths to overcome these objections. So I would just say, in order to truly empower the party that is seeking to resolve the conflict, we must provide a clear faith-based mediation model that sets aside the cultural issues. Mm-hmm. Such an approach, I think, will help the parties break through communication barriers and prioritize their roles and responsibilities within the Islamic context to ultimately bring about the continuation of a healthy relationship.
Thank you. So we need to get to, I think you're saying we need to get to the values of the Islamic ethos rather than the cultural dress in which they are often presented to us.
Absolutely.
Really important point. Thank you. So Dr. Keshavjee, so this is the first round of questions to the panelists from myself. I've got a few more questions, which I hope we can answer very, very quickly. And then in about 5 or 6 minutes, if we open up the floor to the audience, because I'm sure that I can see that there are questions piling up there as well. So Mohamed, following on this thread of this discussion then about religion, what extent is there a perception that if Muslims engage in this sort of work in mediation, it'll be Sharia based, with all the negative connotations of that term Sharia that I know we're all aware of. And then I think there's another part to that question. That is, you yourself were responsible for coordinating a major global mediation training program. Tell us a little bit about that in a few words, and also what challenges you faced in using traditional systems and trying to bring them in line with contemporary mediation practice. There's a lot there, but so I'll summarize for you: Sharia and its perception, and how much of a problem does that pose? And secondly, your experiences and challenges of working within a system that is traditional, working in a contemporary setting.
Thank you. I'll try and be very brief. Yes, to what extent? I think, Dilwar, informal justice within the Muslim context in diasporic settings has given rise to a lot of concerns among some diasporic Muslims and largely among non-Muslims in the diaspora, that the negative connotations associated with Sharia will seep into the mediation practice. This is the heart of the debate. If you look at what happened in Canada, see what happened in Britain when the then Archbishop Rowan Williams gave his talk at the Inns of Court, it went viral. It took 10 years for people to come to a civilized dialogue of the kind we're having here. So the sad part is, to what extent do people understand what the Sharia stands for? The Sharia is an ethical moral vision. The fiqh is a time-specific jurisprudential understanding, which is absolutely fluid, and it is very malleable based on time, circumstances, necessity, and a whole lot of other equitable and legalistic principles. But sadly, the debate in both Canada and in United Kingdom became rather sadly polemical, mutually self-recriminative, and also became very much based on demonization. And I think that we have to be realistic. There are problems with faith-based mediation, not only among Muslims, among all religious communities. But I think that it's much more nuanced. I think that Kim touched on it, that what is the nature of the accommodation between the state, the individual, and the faith. These are constant discussions taking place in more fields than just only mediation. But luckily, as time has gone by, you've got the Marion Boyd Commission in Ontario, which really went deep into the issue. And there's a brilliant commission that Dr. Boyd came up, she was the Attorney General of Ontario. Similarly, in Britain, we had the commission that headed by Mona Siddiqui. So I think it's a little bit more nuanced. And you say to what extent, I think we still need to rebut that presumption that any Muslim doing mediation anywhere will bring in a 10th century understanding of what the Sharia is. So I think people need to understand the differentiation between Sharia as a moral, capacious, moral vision, fiqh as a time-specific understanding of the Sharia through human agency, and how the process is amenable to constant change through the fluidity that we live as human beings. And so I think that I've tried to explain to that, and I'm very happy to say that academic work since has enriched the whole discourse. In Canada, we had a book called Debating Sharia, came out of the University of Toronto, which was an edited version by a woman called Anna Kortweg and Jennifer Selby. And in Britain, hats off to the Reverend Robin Griffith-Jones, the master of Middle Temple Inn, who, with Mark Hill of the Church of England, also brought about an edition with the beautiful articles by Muslims and non-Muslims. And I think those type of academic outpourings, coupled with these type of discussions, do contribute towards a better understanding. Now, your final question, how did we deal with these issues? Because when His Highness gave this remit to a group of us to work on, we went to all the countries. The Ismaili community lives in all the major countries where other Muslims as well live. And not only Muslims, but Hindus, Christians, Jews. I mean, we live in all those countries. We had to embrace and respect the system that was on the ground. We could not come in with boots and say, this is rubbish, we got a new program, I got it from England. Nobody would take it. I mean, in Afghanistan, on one occasion, we had 34 men and 7 women and about 32 men in a mediation program. And the women wouldn't speak at all. But we knew that they were wondering, can we speak? Is this right? These are people coming from outside. Can we say something? Will it be embarrassing? And we had role plays. And one of the participants was a former mayor of Kabul. And we made him a mother-in-law in one case. And we made the daughter-in-law the mediator. We changed the roles. And the amount of laughter we had, I've never seen a training program so funny. But it broke the barriers. And it made people realize that we all are human. We live in a human context. And to what extent do cultural norms predominate under the name of Sharia in particular position? And this is what Kim was mentioning. The power issue, the power balance issue is there. So I think that in the program that we did in each of these countries, not only did we accept that factor, but we also took local people. And in our program, we had men and women. In every case, there are probably more women in the Ismaili Conciliation and Arbitration Training Board today than men. And they deal with cases of the community. So I think by doing it in this way, training people, and never delegitimating the past, I think we got to have change in a steady state. But we found that people we trained, who were from the traditional background, began to say, let us bring younger people in, let us see what is the world they're viewing. So we made sure that the principles of mediation were embraced. And in our programs, we had people from all around. We had people from Britain, we had men and women, we had Muslim trainers in India. 3 judges of the Supreme Court trained our program. And I think Amr will remember he flew into, I think, Florida once with 1 or 2 of his students, and he taught on the Ismaili program. So I think the program was very open to embrace as much as we could learn, but always remembering that the ethical values like compassion, care, equality, fairness, honesty, I think these are universal principles, but they're very deeply embedded in our thinking. Those are very deep Islamic principles, rather than saying, if you do this, God will be upset with you. This is your assigned role. You must accept it. But we accept the fact that that was the situation in some countries.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let me move to Amr and ask him, that was really helpful. And I think this point about differentiating between what we see as Sharia and what we see as fiqh is really, really important. I mean, it's so important to much of the other work that we do as well. We're seeing Sharia as a set of universal values and principles that are sort of, long-term, fiqh as something that is, well, literally man-made in the sense that it's our understanding of what Islam has come to represent, but it's often it's always in a time context. So, Dr. Abdalla, looking at that question a bit further, we've got contemporary practices of mediation, we've got fiqh principles in the way that they work in many different countries in the Muslim world, with different schools of thought, different modalities of the way in which fiqh is either more or less dynamic in different countries. How do we make all of this work? Is it possible to make it work?
Yes, but I think the picture is way more complex than to put it fiqh versus a legal approach or something like that. I think that throughout the whole Muslim world, there are competing and complementary value systems that, and maybe I can mention them in terms of like 4 distinct value systems. There is, of course, the religious value system that guide us we're talking now in the Muslim context. And that, of course, is in itself very complex. It includes a lot of the legalistic, fiqh-based approaches, but it also has a lot about the true essence of what Islam is. But all in all, it is a source of guidance for Muslims all over the world. But I will come back to it to just explain not every Muslim is living by that. Second value system is the traditional, or call it culture, as I see in some of the comments. And this is not about religion or Islam. It is about the culture, the Egyptian culture, the Afghan culture, and even within that, there are specific elements for particular groups. But this culture is so important, and I think that's what many of my colleagues already mentioned, that the problem is our understanding of Sharia or Islam is so colored by some culture understandings and practices, and that creates a big problem. And the third one, I'll call it the modern value system, by which we are talking about certain values and practices that we have embraced by living in modern time, more Western-based approaches for how we think of democracy, how we think of women's rights, how we think of who is a good person and how they should behave. Obviously, this has been a strong, powerful value system influencing Muslims everywhere in the world. And then the fourth one, and that is particular to being in a conflict, I call it the legal value system. And that's when you are thinking of things in terms of legalistic. If I go to court, this is how I make my argument. I will sue you for this. And some people are just stuck in this is the only way I can deal with conflict. If you take those four value systems, they are not static. They are so fluid. And as a matter of fact, they influence every human being to a different degree, depending on your background and where you're from. So if I say, back to your point about fiqh, if I take some people in say very westernized settings in big cities in the Muslim world, or even as diaspora, some of them have no attachment, zero attachment to their Islamic principles, and they are more attached to the modern value system, and especially the emphasis on individualism and my right as an individual, which is fantastic. But in this case, if you try to impose on them a fiqh-based approach, it just doesn't make any sense to them. You go to another setting that is more rural, more traditional and classic, and you're going to find that people want to see a mix of their traditional values and also with something from Islamic principles, and so on. So the picture is so complex, and we cannot really say everyone has to fit under one model. Our job in the field of conflict resolution and ADR and mediation particularly is to know how to navigate between those four to make it appropriate. However, having said this, I'm very aware of that disempowerment, the suppression and oppression of certain groups, especially women and others, because of certain interpretations, some traditional practices that have persisted over centuries. We have a job as mediators to be aware of this and not ethically, not to allow them to persist and to be reinforced. And that makes our job even more complex as mediators in the Muslim context, because sometimes we have to realize there are red lines, beating your wife, abusing your children, and there are so many red lines that we know we are suffering from in our Muslim context, and unfortunately they have been reinforced and sanctioned by wrong interpretations and traditional practices. As mediator, are you going to step back and say, well, what can I do? It's the culture? No, you're going to have to really find that your role is varying, and that's why I am concerned about the classic notion of mediation that's coming from the very Western understanding of a professional mediator. I am afraid that we are forcing ourselves in a straitjacket in the Muslim world if we insist that this is the only form of mediation that we know how to use. If we do this, then I'm afraid we'll be actually either pushing people away because they don't find the solution that is just and fair and transformative, or we would be imposing on them solutions that are not acceptable to them. What we need to do is to be reflective.
Thank you.
And
no, sorry, such important points. Thank you. And I wish we had 2 or 3 hours to discuss points, because they're so important. And maybe we can organize a follow-up event where we can go into 1 or 2 of these lines in a little bit more detail. But thank you so much. Let me move to Aisha very quickly. And if I can just ask the panelists to get through this bit quite quickly, then we can open up to the audience. So Aisha, in the context of Muslims engaging in mediation, what does this provide that the state or other ADR systems doesn't provide for people? Is there any advantage? Is there any benefit in doing this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just quickly cover a couple of really big points under this question. So mediation within the Muslim context, I would say first and foremost provides comfort and familiarity more than anything else. Usually when a community member is facing a hopeless situation with a communication breakdown, or in more serious situations, emotional or physical abuse, it is natural to be overcome with a feeling of helplessness or paralysis. And it is really just human nature to seek out someone you know, someone you are familiar with, as opposed to a complete stranger, to provide that support. Someone who even shares the same language, especially perhaps for recent immigrants. And I would say this is why mediation within the community can provide an effective method of conflict resolution, and why awareness about such resources can go a long way. So alternatively, here in the US, we have court-mandated mediation for family disputes. We also have organizations like JAMS and the AAA for commercial disputes, who do charge exorbitant fees that the average person simply cannot afford. One thing to note about these options is they also generally lack privacy. I think we discussed this earlier. The dispute can be made public through court records, whereas mediation within a Muslim context can remain private. More importantly, I would say most importantly here, a communal system of mediation provides communal accountability. So for many Muslim women who decide to marry within the faith, within the community, it really is taking into account, like, look at the root cause analysis. It is because of the faith-based framework that provides her the security, the protection from her spouse, and communal accountability in the event of a conflict. So in faith-based mediation, there are these ethical values that are drawn directly from the faith that secular systems just don't provide. One example is where courts may require higher evidentiary standards to prove, let's say, abuse, such as police reports or medical reports. However, in ADR and mediation, there is greater flexibility on what facts and evidence can be considered, because here the goal is not to get fixated on evidentiary standards and outdated statutory laws, but to get to the bottom of the dispute through a thorough understanding of the issues and analyzing those within a faith-based framework. So knowing that there is a sense of accountability with the result of the mediation, whether it could be through some sort of written agreement or even, the mere presence of witnesses from the community, really can provide a sense of due process and closure to the conflict much faster, than pursuing litigation, which can drag on. So just to quickly recap, I obviously am an advocate of mediation within the Muslim context because of all of these reasons and because it provides such a valuable framework of values and principles that really adds to the richness of this particular dispute resolution mechanism.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Last two questions, one to Mohamed, one to Kim. So to Dr. Keshavjee, where is the field heading? Where's all of this stuff around mediation going? Some people are talking about transformative mediation and other things that can even make them superior to litigation. What's your view? Where do you think it's all going?
I think mediation is here to stay. I think we need to now morph to the next level of mediation. 20 years ago, when we got into this game, we were looking at a model, and I think Amra knows this very well, that there was only one model we could work with. When the Ismaili program started, there was only a Western model. But we took the Western model knowing full well that immediately we rolled it out to the first new country, there will have to be adaptation. The Ismaili program was within the community context, and then it went to Pakistan. We did it in Hunza, we did it in Karachi. We listened to how people decide their cases there. What are things that are important to them? What does the family mean? What does the aunt mean because she brought up the kids? She may not be related to you, but she's an auntie. Because after school, she cooked food for you and brought it to your home. So you can't keep all these people out. You don't bring them all into the mediation session, but you have a matrix that takes into consideration more than an individualistic problem-solving, satisfying type of a model, which is very highly westernized. But we took the Western model and we modified it. We modified it over 10 years to the extent that some of the things we picked up on the ground came back in the practice in England. Tony Watling was one of our trainers, a brilliant man, a great learner. And he said, look, these are the things we are learning from Muslim communities throughout the world. And we think we need to introduce it in our thinking. So it was a two-way process. Where is it moving? Well, I think transformative mediation is something not to overlook, because the type of issues that Aisha was speaking about, conflict is a transformative process. We shy away from conflict, but conflict can be an opportunity. It takes you to another level of relationship, another level of spiritual growth. And I think that people like Folger and Bush have written the book, The Promise of Mediation. They said if mediation is just an alternative to litigation, then what are you doing more than what litigation can do, except trying to solve the 2 or 3 things I said that were the challenges? Does it mean tomorrow if you solve the challenges, everybody should be brought back into the litigation field? I think the thinking is that there's a rich potential there. And I've made the point globally quite a few times that when I look at people like Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, and Nelson Mandela, I tell people these were the great precursors of transformative mediation. There was a spiritual, moral perspective underpinning their conflict relations, based on how do you cleanse yourself, how do you recognize the other, and the African culture has it, Ubuntu. The whole process of Ubuntu was the bridge through which 350 years of apartheid, very opposite day today, that Mandela was able to draw from the African culture to bring about this process of what does it mean to forgive? What does it mean to dehumanize the next person? So you don't enter into a field of perpetual victimhood. They didn't do that in Rwanda, but they did it in South Africa. So you can see the richness of its potential. But I think we need to move to the next stage. And I think this can happen. Discourses of the kind we're having here today, to me, can be very enriching, because it should not say, this is how we Muslims do it. I would like to say, how do human beings do it? And what perspective do we bring to the table as Muslims who have worked both in majority countries, but also in diasporic context? So it's dialogic in the true sense.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And that made me think also of the potentials that Truth and Reconciliation had in that process as well. Although, of course, it's a complicated, what happened, eventually was complicated, but there was so much potential there in terms of that bringing the healing that was required. And my last question, and then I'll take questions from the audience. I'm hoping everybody's enjoying it. We've got about 15 or 20 minutes left. If people are able to stay on a little bit longer, we can, but we will be wrapping up quite soon. I know it's getting late for some of you. So Kim, we're living through this very strange, bizarre time of this coronavirus pandemic. And no doubt this will be creating conflicts. We know that there are increasing rates of conflicts at a domestic level, at social and cultural level, in different parts of our lives. What does this say for mediation? And is there a role for, say, things like online forms of mediation? How do you think this will affect us looking at this going forward?
Very good question, Dilwar, and I wish I had an answer to that. What we see is that this is also creating new opportunities. We are doing different things more and more online in areas where some time ago we would probably never have imagined doing these kind of things online at universities and classes and so on. So there certainly is a potential field waiting for online solutions. Now, before a concept such as mediation can be successfully brought online, I think there are some important things that need to happen within Muslim communities and within the field of mediation. And I've touched upon it earlier on. There is a kind of maturity that needs to grow within Muslim communities in how we think about conflict. And also, mediation is not a one-stop solution for everything. There are situations in which mediation can be extremely helpful, but there are also solutions, and I'm thinking of the case I brought up before. If and Aisha and others have given examples of abusive relationships, etc. Whether it's online or offline, face-to-face, there are certain situations where mediation isn't the best possible approach, or at least the style of mediation that should be used should be able to draw certain boundaries. Some things are just not acceptable, and if they are not acceptable, they are not mediatable in a sense. And so, yeah, I think mentalities are still growing in their maturity about this kind of topics. And in a way, in terms of expertise, I feel that maybe some Muslim communities are a bit ahead of others. If we look at this important fields of how to integrate solutions from a legal perspective and from an Islamic perspective, I think the UK and the US are probably ahead of European countries such as France and the Netherlands and Belgium. But maybe there is also potential in online online exchanges such as this forum, where actually we can learn from each other in this field as well.
So there's a question here. What are the best practices for educating Muslim communities about mediation? Does anybody want to volunteer to take that?
Can I try that?
Sure.
What we found in our experience is that when we did the training program in different countries, we had the program itself. There were men and women. They were deeply embedded in the culture of the country. But when we had evening times after prayer sessions, we got people together. We told them what the program is all about, and we impressed upon them that litigation is not the way forward. It doesn't fit in with our cultural, social, religious concepts. But we didn't bring heavy doses. We told people, look, when you go to litigation, when a brother fights a brother, when a man fights a woman, who suffers? The children suffer, the family suffers. You're taking food off the table. And we found that when they saw that there was a professional way in which this was going to be done, and that it is not in the arena of each fighting the other, people began to slowly see the value. But it's not something that's going to come overnight. You're going to need people, you're going to take on in your trust the traditional resolvers. I found in my PhD thesis that I spoke to the imams of the masjids here in Hounslow and all that, and they were fascinated by the work I was doing. They said, can you train us imams in this? Please train us so we can talk in our khutbahs. We can talk, we'll know what to tell people when they have their conflicts. So I think it's not a one solution immediately. There's a multiple ways in which you socialize a community from within itself. And that I found was very valuable for what I did.
Thank you. There's a general question about how do you promote a mindset of conflict resolution when among some Muslim communities, emotions or individuals, emotions seem to cloud judgment in people. So it's related to what you're saying, but moving from a mindset of conflict to conflict resolution, I guess. Is there anything anybody wants to say about that?
Well, I think I will build on what Mohammed said, that and from what we have seen in trainings, when you connect people to the elements in our faith, in our sources in Islam, that touch particularly on those issues, the emotion, the strong emotion, the demonizing of the other, and so on, and make them realize that actually there is another way of looking at those sources, and realize that if your objective, and I think for many people who adhere to Islam, or for them it's an important part of their life, they want to be good Muslims. No one wants to be a bad Muslim. I mean, if they are adhering to Islam, but it is a direction that they are taking. And I believe that the tools we have been developing for conflict resolution from Islamic perspectives, including mediation and peace building from Islamic perspective, have helped us to discover or uncover important elements that otherwise were not discovered by the traditional dominant fiqh. Because fiqh, by nature, focused on the legal dimension. And I don't expect somebody looking at the legal rules and trying to establish legal rules to look at some of those other areas of conflict, such as the emotion, such as the behavior, such as the attitude that develops, and to dig deeper into the sources of the conflict. That's what we do. And by doing this, we help people to connect closer to their Islam, and at the same time to know that insisting on practices like what you mentioned is actually counterproductive or doesn't make you truly the good Muslim that you think you are.
There's a couple of questions, quite a few questions around gender. I'm going to take a couple of strands and try and throw them to the panel. So there's one that said, should mediation clauses be included as a mandatory practice in marriage contracts? Would that help? And then there's another one here about from the same person a little bit later, talking about the level, an ignorance or perhaps not acknowledging the level of patriarchy that is there within Muslim communities. And also related to this, another question that is saying, how can we mediate to mitigate patriarchy in Muslim organizations and mosques is it even possible for a man to mediate when most men cannot understand the issues and problems, the oppression of women that is there on a day-to-day basis? So how do we deal with this, and how do we take Muslim leaders to the table of mediation when perhaps they don't see a problem? They don't perceive that there is a problem. How do we begin to deal with it? It's open.
I'm happy to share something from my research experience. I interviewed hundreds of members of Muslim families in Belgium, but also dozens of imams and mosque workers that were involved in conflict resolution processes. And what I saw there is that actually they are aware of a number of problems, but they just don't know what to do about it. And actually, they were very interested in being trained in conflict resolution skills, for instance. What they were more skeptical about was being trained on Islamic principles, because that was where they felt they had the necessary expertise. However, in many of the discussions I had, they weren't aware of how best to implement these general principles in the particular context of the countries where they happen to live, Belgium in this case. And so they were interested, carefully, but still more or less openly interested in engaging in a reflection about how these Islamic principles should be applied in this particular situation. And of course, that requires that the teachers and trainers that would give this kind of courses would have the necessary level of expertise in this field in order to be credible and acceptable in this context. But there was a genuine interest, and there was a genuine awareness of what is happening. What was lacking, though, was gender sensitivity, like just basically general information from sociology, from law, about gender stereotypes, the many barriers that women encounter and what this does with family relations, communication skills in general. And so if all of this is included in a training package, that can actually be something that is hopeful. As to the question concerning marriage contracts in the Belgian context, a problem that we have is that there is not even a single standard type of Islamic marriage contract people could use. And simply working on this, bringing Muslim leaders from local communities together and work on this, including women and including a gender perspective on what types of things should be included in marriage contract is probably an important thing to do. Whereas mediation Mohamed insisted on the voluntary character of mediation, a clause that makes it mandatory is probably not the best approach, but just to signal that this exists and that this is an option that is always available to people whenever they face a conflict is probably a better fitted solution.
Thank you. I think actually you wanted to speak as well.
Yeah, let me add on the patriarchal challenges. So I just want to quickly say, look, like in the environment that we're in, I mean, it's COVID. We need to look at this as an opportunity to really go back to the whiteboard, right? And to make the inclusion of women within the conflict resolution process intentional. We need to make the inclusion of women, if it's going to require going back to your bylaws of your organization and say, we must have at least X number of women representation. Right? This is 2020. This is all about like, how is our future going to look? And I think that anything that we do has to be a creative approach. I don't think that there's one answer. I think there's several answers. It's really just a matter of sitting down and thinking like, okay, how can we better train our leadership? And how can we invite the women so that there's not that threatening nature of, okay, the power imbalance is going to shift by having these sisters join us. So it's really about the attitude that, you know, these our leaders have. It's just about having these honest conversations, building relationships and building that trust so that the inclusion of women, you know, is intentional and hopefully, inshallah, benefits us when it comes to mediation as well.
Thank you so much.
If I may add just also on the same point that, because I was worried that the colleague who made that point perhaps had an interesting perspective on what we're saying, or some of us. But I just want to emphasize here that I think this panel is very aware of some of the deep issues that exist in our communities worldwide, especially patriarchy. And dealing with the injustices that happen because of this on all levels is something that is inherent in everything that any of those four people have written or have spoken about when we speak of mediation. And it is a matter of actually how can we make sure that we're gonna design or work with models of mediation that will know how to address injustices, especially injustices happen against women and against any oppressed group. And I think that a good look at this will show that it's in the heart of what we're doing.
Thank you. If I can ask for like 1 or 2 sentence answers, I'll pick on a couple more points. So does restorative justice play a part in mediation in Islamic contexts?
Restorative justice is at the heart of it. I think the whole notion of forgiveness, the power of apology, the ability to exercise compassion, it's much more, and I think even the fiqh itself, funny enough, that Islamic law is the only law that says that if you take somebody's life, the victim has to be compensated. It's very different from Western legal systems. So what I think is that within our juridical landscape, in our juridical tradition, the notion of distributive justice is much more powerful, even in our criminal justice system. The Islamic criminal justice system was predicated on the restorative process, and not on the process of punitive nature. If we can draw that out of our juridical heritage and make it speak to us in a new context, in the context of conflict resolution for today, I think it's possible. So I think there's a very big role for restorative justice in mediation, and particularly Muslim mediation as well.
There was a question about ADR, and when does ADR become binding on all of the parties? It's more of a technical question, I think, for those of you who are involved in this area. Anybody want to take that?
Could I?
Yep, go for it.
Yeah, basically, you can walk away from mediation right up to the 11th hour. But once the parties are convinced that that's what they want and they've agreed and they feel comfortable, when they then agree to a memorandum of understanding, when they sign that, then that memorandum of understanding becomes like a binding contract. So if somebody reneges on that, you can then decide whether you want to have another mediation later on or whether you want to even go to a court of law. A court of law will respect a binding mediatory agreement in case the parties do not agree to what they have agreed. So it is non-binding until the moment that everybody is comfortable enough that that represents what they want. And so that becomes the consensus of the parties.
Thank you. And maybe the final question then. So there's one here, again, it's sort of family related. So is mediation always the answer? What happens when there is an abusive relationship and the couple are reconciled only for the husband to return to a normality of re-abuse against the spouse? So maybe there are times when mediation isn't the answer. What do you say about that?
Amr?
Sure. Very briefly, for the sake of time. This is why our model that we are developing for mediation, it would be maybe a misnomer to think about it as mediation from the highly individualistic Western sense, because that will not work unless you're going to always have to say, well, I'm out as a mediator because I have ethical violations here, and I'm sending you to the police or to the court, or I'm going to withdraw. We think that we are aware of the depth of those issues, and we want our mediators in a model that we envision to be more proactive about those issues and to take the necessary steps, whether it is to engage the authorities when there is abuse to the level of a crime, or you want to have professional help to make sure that such issues are not going to be recurring and become a pattern of behavior once they leave the mediation room. We want to develop different tools for mediators in the Muslim context to address particularly those issues of oppression and injustices without just the simple one, well, I'm throwing the white flag and I am just leaving you to the court or to the police. No, we need to actually develop almost close to activism and advocacy approaches that can be embedded within what we envision as a mediation process in the Muslim context, in order to address such deeper issues, in addition to the classic, of course, form of mediation that works on the interests and needs that we are familiar with. But we are very cognizant the Muslim societies worldwide have deeper issues. If you neglect them, then you are not really adding something of benefit. And that's why also I go back to a point I made earlier. Mediation without good education in peace and conflict resolution is not as effective, especially in the Muslim context.
So that's it then. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to say, just give you all maybe 10 seconds or so, 10, 15 seconds, if you want to say any final words as your own reflections, thoughts, sum up, and I think then I'll just wrap up the webinar for today.
I'd like to say that we're so thankful to New Horizons that we've started this narrative where we are discussing and dialoguing the issues of the ADR as a whole. I mean, the problems we're talking about today affect all other communities as well. And I think this is a very rich discourse, and I want to thank New Horizons for giving this opportunity to us and to people who are interested in this field to get into a true dialogic process of understanding and understanding with a view to learning, to looking into ourselves and say, what are things we can improve on? So all I can say is that I've found this a very rich possibility and a lovely session from which I myself have learned a lot, you know.
Thank you very much. Who wants to go?
I second Mohammed on that. Thank you so much for the professionalism and excellent topic.
Thank you again. I just think that this discussion is so timely and so needed. I really appreciate the invitation. I just think that, you know, this is, again, a great opportunity for us. And so these are difficult times, but I think we can definitely make the most of them. So appreciate you having me.
I want to join my colleagues in this panel to in thanking you for holding this very, very inspiring discussion. And yeah, as I said earlier, I think there is a great potential in mediation, but it has still to realize its full potential. And occasions like this are opportunities to really think about what are the issues that are important, and I'm very grateful for that. It's always inspiring.
Well, thank you all, and thank you to the people who have joined us, all of the people that have logged in and have been listening from different parts of the world, all sorts of different parts of the globe and different time zones. I know it's very late for some of you and it's very early for some of you. Really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us. This was such an interesting and important conversation. I hope we can do more of it. I'd really like to thank the panelists because they've been so good at, I know they're all experts and they've got a lot to offer in terms of their ideas about these issues. We've pushed their ideas into very, very short segments. So I thank them for allowing me to do that. For indulging me, but I hope we can do more of these things. I think there's a lot of mileage in looking at some of these strands of issues. We could see some distinct strands around Sharia, fiqh, around gender relations, around training and education, around leadership and change. And perhaps we can, go drill down further into some of these issues more specifically. I'd like to thank our partners, Karamah. So it wasn't just New Horizons organizing this. Karamah also involved in this. And also to Mohammed and Amr for coming to us with the idea and for helping us frame this and think about this very carefully. So both organizations, nhorizons.org, karamah.org, please look up their websites, like, share, go onto their social media, engage in the organization, sign up to their mailing lists. And all I can say is thank you for joining us. God bless you all. I hope we can work for a better world with less conflict and a space where we can resolve our disputes in a better way. Clearly, there's a need for this sort of approach, and I hope that this has helped us at least take just one small step, perhaps, but one step forward. And I would also like to thank Manish and Soraya, who are from our team, and they've been behind the scenes. Working with us and supporting us in organizing this event, as well as managing things technically throughout today. So thank you, everybody. Take care. Stay safe.